Rafe had carried his dying 4-year-old 60 miles across New Mexico territory, never guessing the widow who took them in would change both their lives forever and put her own neck in a noose to do it. May's small body had gone slack against his back an hour before sundown, her breath a thin, wet rattle against his neck, and by the time the ranch house rose out of the heat shimmer, he was no longer walking so much as falling forward, one boot in front of the other, praying the woman in the doorway wouldn't turn him away. 3 days before he'd walked out of the last watering hole he knew the name of, with May tied to his back in a wrap he'd fashioned from his own shirt, because carrying her that way left both his hands free for whatever the trail decided to throw at them. Nebraska had taken everything else first, a swarm of locusts that stripped his wheat down to bare dirt in a single afternoon, then the fever that had carried off his wife Sarah before the following spring even broke. He'd buried her himself because there'd been no money left for a proper man to do it, and he'd promised her grave, in the particular way a man promises the dead things he can't take back, that May would not follow her mother into that same cold ground. He'd been walking on that promise alone for 140 miles, and it was wearing thinner with every step. The ranch he was walking toward had a history older than the fences around it. Nascha's people had known this stretch of the Mogollon foothills for generations, long before any territorial line was drawn across a survey map, and the deed her husband Chody had filed with the county was in her own mind simply the paper the outside world required to acknowledge that a spring like the one on this section belonged to whoever cared for it well enough to keep it running through a dry year. She had grown up watching her mother weave, watching her father read weather in the shape of clouds over the Mogollon rim, and she carried both of those inheritances into the running of this ranch the same way she carried her braid over one shoulder each morning, quietly, without needing anyone's permission to do so. She was already watching him come. Nascha stood at the top of her own steps with her arms folded and her weight set back on her heels, a woman built for standing her ground, dark hair braided close against a sky gone the color of a bruise. She had heard drifters' stories before, sad ones, true ones, one spun purely to get a boot in the door, and her face gave nothing away while she watched this particular stranger stagger the last 100 yards under a limp child. Only her eyes moved, tracking the small hand fisted in his collar, the way his knees kept buckling and catching and buckling, like a man walking on the last thread of his own will. Rafe stopped at the fence, because a man with nothing had learned the hard way not to cross a threshold. He hadn't been invited over. "Ma'am, I'm not here to beg trouble on you. My girl is burning up, and I've got nowhere left to walk." His voice had scraped itself down to gravel somewhere around mile 50. Nascha's gaze slid from his cracked lips to the child's face, pressed sideways against his shoulder, lips gone the color of ash. She had buried enough of her own to know exactly what that color meant, and how little time it left a person to decide. Bring her to the well first. She was already moving before the sentence finished, pumping the handle herself, filling a tin cup, and pressing it into Rafe's shaking hands without asking him a single question about who he was or where he'd come from. May's lips parted for the water, a small mercy that made Rafe's throat close up entirely. "Fever. 3 days," he managed once he trusted his own voice again. "No money to my name. I can mend fence, break stock, dig, haul, whatever needs doing. I only need a corner to lay her down and a little milk to keep the life in her." Nascha studied him the way a person studies a horse they're thinking of buying. Hands, boots, the set of his shoulders, the particular exhaustion that comes only from carrying someone else's weight instead of your own. She saw the calluses. She saw the way he kept his body angled between his daughter and the son, even now, even half dead himself. "I don't need a hired man." Something in him collapsed before she'd finished the sentence. He turned, already bracing to walk back into the emptiness he'd come from, one arm tightening around May, as though he could shield her from disappointment the same way he'd shielded her from the sun. Wait. The word cut clean through the yard. Rafe stopped without turning, afraid that if he faced her and found nothing in her expression, his legs would simply give out for good. Nascha came down off the last step and circled until she stood in front of him instead of behind. I didn't say leave. I said I don't need a hired man. Those aren't the same thing. Her jaw was tight, the words costing her something she wasn't in the habit of spending. I have a price, not wages, a price for the roof and the milk, and whatever medicine gets that fever broken before morning. Rafe waited, every nerve strung tight, ready to trade anything. His labor, his pride, 10 years off the back end of his own life, to hear the terms, I want a daughter. The words landed on him like a slap out of a clear sky. His arm clamped around May so hard, she stirred and whimpered against his shoulder, and for one wild animal second, he thought he'd misheard her entirely. Thought this hard-eyed widow meant to take his child the way the county courts back in Nebraska had once threatened. I won't sell her, low and rough, every hair on his arm standing up. I don't care. How bad off we are. She's mine. Nascha didn't flinch from the accusation in his voice. If anything, something in her face went stiller. I'm not asking you to sell me anything. I'm asking you to stay, both of you. I want to love a child the way a mother loves one. Not own her, not replace her, not take her from you. Just love her. That's the whole of the cost, Rafe, and I won't ask it twice. Rafe searched her face for the lie in it, the trap, the angle a desperate man learns to look for on instinct. He found instead a grief so old and so carefully buttoned down, it took his breath clean away, the way a person can tell a wound runs deep by how still someone holds the arm around it. You lost someone. Quiet. Not quite a question, and he didn't press it twice. Nascha's eyes went to the horizon, to the low blue hills where the light was dying fast. Bring her inside, was the only answer she gave him, and she turned back toward the house without waiting to see if he'd follow. The house smelled of pinon smoke and dried sage, swept clean, quiet as a held breath. Nascha laid May in a small bed beneath a blanket woven the deep red of desert earth, its pattern worked by hands that had clearly loved the making of it. She set a basin of cool water on the floorboards and began wringing cloths from May's forehead with a tenderness that startled Rafe more than her hardness had. Go wash at the pump. There's a cot in the tack room. I'll bring stew once she's settled. He hesitated in the doorway, feeling every inch the ragged intruder in that clean, ordered room. Thank you, he managed. She only nodded once, already lost again in the work of nursing a stranger's child, as though her own life depended on it. That night the wind came down off the hills hard enough to rattle the shutters, and Nascha kept her vigil past midnight, then past 2, changing cloths, murmuring old low songs in a tongue Rafe didn't know, but felt in his chest anyway. The same songs her own mother had once sung over her. Twice May's breathing thinned so faint that Nascha bent close with her ear to the small chest, counting heartbeats, bargaining silently with whatever still listened after everything she'd already lost. In the barn, Rafe sat wide awake on the narrow cot, unable to sleep, thinking of his wife Sarah, gone 8 months now to a fever not unlike the one currently deciding his daughter's fate. He wondered whether this stranger's kindness was too good to survive contact with the world, the way most good things on the frontier seemed to be. Somewhere near 3 in the morning he heard footsteps cross the yard and looked up to find Nascha in the barn doorway with a lantern, checking on him the same quiet way she'd been checking on May all night. She never explained the visit. She only set a second blanket over his shoulders against the cold, and left before he could find the words to thank her for a kindness she likely didn't think was worth remarking on at all. Dawn broke golden quiet over the yard, and when Rafe crossed to the house, his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He found Nascha in the kitchen, with May propped against her arm, spooning broth. Between small, cracked lips, the girl's eyes were open, clear, fixed on the woman feeding her with the drowsy, trusting attention of a child who has decided, unprompted, that she is finally safe. Fever broke a little before sunup. Nascha still hadn't looked away from May. She'll be weak a few days yet, but she'll live. Rafe's knees actually buckled that time, and he had to grip the door frame to stay upright. Months of holding himself together finally cracking open all at once. He didn't know how to thank a stranger for a thing this size. "Fix the north fence." She let the quiet stretch a moment longer. "That'll do for a start." He worked like a man reborn. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Neither of them had expected to want again. Rafe up before light, mending rail and rebuilding the sagging corral, riding out to gather Nascha's scattered cattle from arroyos where 2 dry seasons had pushed them, looking for shade and water. He dug a new stock tank by hand when the old one cracked, hit good water on the 4th day, and stood laughing out loud in the trench, the first laugh he'd managed since Nebraska. Inside, Nascha taught May her letters with a stick. In the swept dirt of the yard, showed her how to gather eggs without cracking the shells, braided her hair the way her own mother had once braided hers, and sang her the old songs at night until the girl stopped waking from nightmares of the trail. The bond crept up on all 3 of them slowly, the way good things do when nobody's watching for them. One evening, Rafe found his torn shirt sleeve mended in neat, careful stitches, and he never mentioned it, only smiled down at his own hands the next morning, like a man who'd forgotten what having a home felt like. May started calling Nascha's kitchen our kitchen without anyone teaching her to. She learned the Apache word for water before she remembered how to spell it in English, and Nascha never once corrected the order of that learning, only smiled the small, private smile of a woman watching a house fill back up with the sound of a child's feet on the floorboards. He watched them sometimes from the shadow of the barn, May trailing Nascha across the yard like a small, devoted shadow, cheeks gone rosy with sun and food and safety, laughing at something too quiet for Rafe to hear from that distance. It cut at him in a way he wasn't proud of, a small, selfish ache at watching someone else become the center of his daughter's world. But then May would turn and run to him too, arms wide, calling his name across the yard, and Rafe understood there was room in a 4-year-old's heart for 2 kinds of safety at once, and that his own chest, lately, had more room in it than he'd known. Enough to notice the particular way the morning light fell across Nascha's face when she thought no one was watching her at all. A late summer storm nearly cost them everything one evening in their 6th week together, and it was the storm more than anything spoken between them that finally settled what the 2 adults had been carefully not naming. Thunderheads had built fast and black over the western hills, while May chased a stray hen too close to the wash, and by the time Rafe spotted the flash flood coming, a wall of brown water and torn brush roaring down a channel that had been bone dry an hour before. The girl was already stranded on a shrinking spit of gravel with the current rising fast around her ankles. He ran harder than he had ever run carrying her across the desert, waded in against water that dragged at his knees, and got both arms around her half a second before the gravel bar vanished under the flood entirely. Nascha met them on the bank, already soaked to the waist herself, having come running the instant she'd heard May scream, and for one long, wordless moment, the 3 of them simply held on to each other in the rain while the wash roared past a few feet from where they stood. No one mentioned it again that night, but something had shifted, quiet and permanent, in the way Nascha reached for May's hand, crossing that same wash from then on, and in the way she let her hand rest a beat longer than it needed to against Rafe's arm before she let go. Late in the summer, 2 of Nascha's cousins rode down from the mountains to trade for salt and check on her the way they did every year since Chody's death, and Rafe watched, half in awe, as the hard-guarded rancher he'd come to know softened into someone laughing easily in a language he didn't speak, her hands moving as fast as her words while she caught them up on the ranch and eventually on the 2 strangers now living under her roof. They studied Rafe carefully, the way family studies anyone new, standing too close to someone they love, and by the time they rode out 2 days later, they'd left him a good deal wiser about how to read the sky before a storm, and considerably more certain that whatever this arrangement was becoming, it had Nascha's whole family's quiet blessing rather than its suspicion. May cried when they left, already fond of the two men who'd taught her a game with smooth river stones, and Nascha promised her, combing the girl's hair back from her face, that they'd come again before the snow. Autumn came down over the basin in a slow gold burn, cottonwoods along the creek turning the color of old coin, and for the first time in longer than either adult could easily remember, the days stopped feeling like a fight simply to survive them. Nascha showed Rafe where the wild plums grew thick along the wash, and they picked them together into a shared basket, while May chased grasshoppers through the grass behind them, shrieking with a joy that had nowhere near existed in her small body 2 months before. In the evenings, Rafe carved little animals from scrap wood for May with his pocket knife, and Nascha would sit mending by the fire, watching the two of them with an expression she hadn't allowed her own face in years, something close to peace, something she was still a little afraid to trust. One such evening, with May long asleep and the fire burned down to embers, Nascha finally raised the question she'd been carrying since the night he'd walked up her lane. What had really driven him out of Nebraska, she wanted to know. Past every other ranch he might have stopped at first, Rafe turned his knife over slowly in his hands a while before he began. There had been a bank in Lincoln County that recalled the note on his farm inside a single season of failed rain, he explained, and a doctor who wanted more silver than he had to even look at Sarah's fever, let alone treat it. He buried his wife with a borrowed shovel and a debt he'd never be able to pay off, and he'd started walking west the following morning because staying meant watching May go the same way, slow and unattended, in a house the bank was going to take from them within the month regardless. He'd heard of New Mexico territory from a drover passing through, heard there was open range, and ranchers desperate enough for hands that a man's past wasn't picked over too closely. He hadn't expected any of it to be true. He especially hadn't expected a woman like her. Nascha listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned to listen to grief a long time before he ever walked up her lane. And when he finished, she shared a little of her own, how Chody had built this house with his own hands the summer they married, how the range around it had been good and generous ground, until the winter of '86 took him along, with half the basin's cattle, how she buried Nalene 3 weeks later, when the same cold finally reached the crib in the corner of this very kitchen. She had sworn to herself afterward that she would never again let herself need another living soul, because needing someone simply handed the winter one more thing to take. Rafe gave her no comfort for that, not in words. He only sat with her in the quiet a long while, the two of them watching the embers instead of each other, until the silence itself became a kind of comfort neither of them had to name out loud. If a story like this one is finding its way to you tonight, take a moment and become a channel member. Tap join beside our channel name. It costs nothing to watch, but it means everything to a small channel like ours. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, riding 4 horses deep and wearing the unhurried confidence of men who own the ground beneath them even when they don't. Emmett Voss ran the largest herd in the basin and had wanted Nascha's water since before her husband Chody died in the winter drought that had taken half the range's cattle along with him. The only reliable spring for 8 dry miles sat square inside her fence line, and Voss had spent 3 years circling it like a man waiting for a woman alone to finally give up and sell. He reined in at her gate with his hat pushed back and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Didn't figure you'd still be squatting out here, Nascha." He let the word squatting sit in the air a beat too long. "Heard you took in a stray 2-man and his brat. Sharing your roof, folks in Cottonwood Springs are starting to talk." "Let them talk." Nascha held her ground on her own porch, May tucked safely behind her skirts. "This is my husband's land deeded fair, and it will stay mine long after you've ridden home to count somebody else's cattle." Voss's smile thinned. "Deeded to Chody." His tone had gone almost gentle, almost like a man delivering sad news instead of a threat. This territory doesn't much care for a widow holding good range on her own, ma'am, especially not a widow of your particular blood. Out here where a man can find a dozen reasons a claim like yours might need revisiting. He touched his hat and turned his horse before she could answer, leaving the threat to do its slow work in the silence he left behind him. Rafe, watching from the corral fence with a hammer still in his hand, felt something cold settle low in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Voss's grudge went back further than the spring itself, though few in the basin remembered it anymore. He had wanted to buy this same section from Chody years before either death touched this house, and had been refused flatly in front of half the town by a man who valued good neighbors over good money and made that plain to his face. Voss was not a man built to forget an insult like that, and a widow alone on the land he'd wanted all along looked to him like nothing more than an unfinished piece of business, waiting on the right piece of paper and the right season of drought to finally come loose. It got worse before it got better, the way trouble in a small territory always does. 2 weeks later, riding into Cottonwood Springs for salt and coffee, Nascha and Rafe felt the whole street go quiet the moment their wagon rolled past the mercantile. Women drew their children closer. A man spat pointedly into the dust near the wagon wheel. Inside the store, the clerk served Rafe in a silence so pointed it had weight to it, and when Nascha stepped to the counter to pay, the mayor's wife sidled up with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "We do worry about you out there alone, taking in strangers the way you do. A person starts to wonder what a woman like you really wants with another man's child." Nascha didn't so much as blink. "She wants for nothing. Can the rest of this town say the same for the children it looks past every single day?" The woman's mouth closed hard, and she retreated in a swirl of taffeta. But the damage of the visit had already been planted, seed by careful seed, in exactly the soil Voss had spent months preparing. Not everyone in that store turned their face away, though it would take Nascha weeks to notice which ones hadn't. The blacksmith's wife caught her eye across the aisle and gave the smallest of nods, the kind that cost a person something in a town like this one to offer at all. An old rancher near the door tipped his hat to Rafe on the way out, unhurried, unbothered by who was watching him do it. Cottonwood Springs was not, in the end, made entirely of the kind of people who'd come to her gate with a marshal's badge. It only sometimes felt that way, standing in the middle of a room gone quiet around you. The blow landed 3 days after that, and it landed hard. A territorial marshal rode up Nascha's lane at midday with 2 deputized men flanking him and a folded paper in his saddlebag that would undo everything she'd built with her own 2 hands since the winter that took her husband and her little girl both. Marshal Otis Crane was not an unkind man by nature, but he was a tired one, and tired men in that country tended to believe whatever paperwork was set in front of them by whoever held the most cattle. He used her husband's name instead of her own, the way the law out here preferred to, as though she had no name that belonged to herself alone. "I've got a filed deed here, laying claim to this range in this spring, dated before your husband's, and a sworn complaint from Emmett Voss that 30 head of his stock have gone missing onto your grass this month, wearing your brand, worked fresh over his." Nascha felt the ground tilt under her, the way it hadn't tilted since the morning they'd buried little Nalene in frozen ground with a spoon because every shovel on the place had broken first. "That deed is a forgery." Her voice didn't rise, didn't break, iron all the way through, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "And I have never in my life run another man's cattle. Emmett Voss wants my water because his own herds have drunk his creek dry, and he means to take it the only way this territory will let a man take land from a widow, with paper and lies, instead of an honest offer." The marshal's face didn't change, because weighing justice wasn't his job out here. Only paperwork was, and paperwork rarely bent to reason. I don't doubt you believe that, ma'am. But I've got a filed complaint and a filed deed, and until the circuit judge rides through to sort which one holds water, I'm bound to take you in and post this range under Voss's provisional claim." He delivered it like a man reading out a sentence he didn't much care for himself, and beneath the tired formality of it, Nascha caught something almost like an apology. Though it changed nothing about the iron cuffs one of his deputies was already unhooking from his belt. May screamed. She came flying off the porch and wrapped both arms around Nascha's waist, so hard the marshal's men had to peel her loose, finger by finger, her small voice tearing itself raw on Nascha's name, over and over into the dust. Rafe was there before he'd decided to move, dropping the axe he'd been splitting kindling with. Every muscle coiled to fight 4 armed men over a woman he'd known less than 2 seasons, and it was Nascha, wrists already bound, who stopped him with nothing but a look. Don't you dare give them a reason to take you too and leave her with no one." Her eyes cut to May, sobbing against Rafe's leg now, and something passed between the 2 adults that needed no more words than that. Take care of her. Whatever happens to me, you take care of that little girl, and you don't let this territory tell either of you what a family's supposed to look like. They let her out at gunpoint's shadow, though no gun was ever drawn, because a woman in handcuffs needs no more persuading than that when her daughter is watching. Rafe stood in the yard, with May shaking against his ribs, and watched the dust of Marshal Crane's horses swallow the only home either of them had found worth keeping, and something in him that had been quietly, patiently mending itself for 2 seasons went sharp and cold and purposeful. He carried May inside, sat her at the kitchen table with bread and butter and every gentle word he had left in him, and then went to the barn and saddled the fastest horse on the place. He was not going to let a forged deed and a rich man's lie become the end of the only good thing either of them had ever found standing. The Cottonwood Springs jail was a single cramped room behind the sheriff's office, one barred window too high to see much through, and Nascha spent that first night sitting upright on the narrow bench rather than lying down, because, lying down, she thought of Chody, of the winter that had taken him and Nalene both, of every door this territory had quietly shut in her face in the years since, simply for being a widow who refused to sell and refused to leave. She had survived all of that standing on her own 2 feet, asking nothing of anyone, and she was not about to let Emmett Voss be the man who finally broke that record. What frightened her most, sitting in that cold cell listening to the town settle into sleep beyond the wall, was not the charge itself, but the silence afterward it would leave in her kitchen. May's small voice, calling for her into an empty house, no one there to answer. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her own sternum, the old trick her mother had taught her, for holding grief in its place, and made herself breathe until the shaking stopped. Whatever came at the hearing, she promised herself she would meet it standing, the way she had met every other hard thing this land had ever sent her. He rode first to Silver City, to the land office where deeds got filed and, more importantly, where clerks kept the ledgers that showed exactly when and how a filing had truly been made. He found a clerk named Horace Adkins who remembered Emmett Voss coming through only 6 weeks prior, remembered because Voss had paid handsomely and quietly to have an entry dated back nearly 2 years, a crime Adkins hadn't dared report alone against a man of Voss's reach, but was finally willing to swear to in writing. Once Rafe made plain that a widow's freedom and a child's whole future hung on the balance of his silence. Adkins slid a folded page across the counter, hands trembling slightly. In case a day like this one ever came, I didn't figure it'd come this fast. From Silver City, Rafe pushed on toward Voss's own range, arriving well past dark, his borrowed horse blowing hard beneath him. He found what he'd gambled on, finding there a bitter, underpaid line rider named Amos Dobbs, who had branded 30 head of Voss's own stock over onto Nascha's grass himself, at Voss's direct order, and who had been drinking steadily for a week straight over the shame of it. Dobbs didn't need much convincing once Rafe laid out plainly what his silence was, about to cost an innocent woman. He stared hard into an empty glass. Voss made it sound like nothing but a scare. Figured she'd sell quick once the marshal came calling. Didn't figure on her hanging for it. Dobbs agreed to ride back with Rafe and swear the truth before the circuit judge, whatever it cost him afterward with Voss, a debt of conscience finally due after a long, cowardly silence. The ride back was its own kind of trial. A flash flood had torn out the low crossing on the Rio Blanco overnight, and Rafe sat his blowing horse on the bank in the gray pre-dawn light, watching brown water churn where a shallow ford had been the day before. Knowing every hour, lost now, was an hour closer to a judge closing his docket and riding on to the next county without ever hearing Nascha's name at all. He found a narrower crossing, a mile upstream, walked the horses across on foot at the deepest part, with the current dragging at his knees and Dobbs cursing steadily behind him, and came up the far bank soaked through and shaking with cold, but moving. Neither man slept the second night. They traded turns dozing in the saddle, while the other kept both horses walking, because a horse that stopped moving in that country before sunup sometimes never started again. They reached Cottonwood Springs at first light after 2 days and 2 nights of hard riding. Rafe's horse lathered, white and stumbling, Dobbs half asleep in the saddle beside him, the forged land office copy folded flat against Rafe's chest, like it was the only thing keeping him upright at all. The circuit judge, a weathered, unhurried man named Alden Reyes, had ridden in the night before to hold court in the back room of the Mercantile, and the whole town had turned out to watch, because nothing moved through Cottonwood Springs faster than the promise of a scandal. Nascha stood at the front of that room in the same blue-trimmed coat she'd been arrested in, spine straight, chin level, refusing to so much as sit in the single chair set out for her, refusing to let this town see her broken, even now. Rafe walked in, covered in 2 days of trail dust, and laid Adkins' sworn letter and the true filing dates on the judge's table, then put Amos Dobbs up to speak his piece in front of God, the judge, and the very man he was accusing. Voss's face went through 3 colors in the space of a minute, pale, then red, then a gray. Rafe recognized from the inside of his own worst mornings while Dobbs laid out plain and unhurried exactly whose cattle had worn Nascha's brand and whose hand had put it there. Judge Reyes read the forged deed's true filing date against the land office copy twice, in total silence, the whole room holding its breath along with him. This deed, he tapped the paper once hard, was filed 2 years after Chody's original claim, not before it, and this court finds Mrs. Nascha's title stands as it always has. As for the stock complaint. His eyes moved to Dobbs, then to Voss, and lingered there a long, cold moment. I believe this territory has heard quite enough this morning to know exactly whose cattle went missing, and whose did not. The room came apart in noise all at once, gasps, low murmurs, someone in the back letting out a short, disbelieving laugh at the sheer nerve of it all. Nascha didn't move at first, didn't trust her own legs, standing utterly still in the middle of the chaos, like a woman waiting to be sure the ground under her wasn't a trick of the light. Then her eyes found Rafe, filthy and swaying with exhaustion in the doorway, and something in her face broke open completely for the first time since he'd known her, not with grief this time, but with disbelief, and beneath that, something warmer still. She crossed the room in 4 long strides and put both hands flat against his chest, as if to check that he was truly real and truly standing there. You rode 2 days without sleeping. I didn't ask you to do that. He covered her hands with his own, dust and all. You didn't have to ask. I'd have ridden 100 more. Emmett Voss did not go quietly. He tried in the last gasping minutes of that hearing to claim confusion, clerical error, an honest man's honest mistake. But Judge Reyes had spent 30 years riding a circuit full of honest mistakes and knew the sound of a guilty one from 3 counties off. Voss's provisional claim was struck from the record on the spot. his complaint against Nascha, dismissed with a note of formal censure that would follow him through every land office in the territory for years afterward, and the marshal looking considerably more tired than he had that morning. Personally escorted Nascha out through the crowd with an apology mumbled low enough that only she could hear it. She accepted it the way she accepted most things that came too late to matter, with a short nod and a very long silence, and then she walked straight past every whispering face in Cottonwood Springs and out into the sunlight toward May, who was waiting on the mercantile steps in the arms of a neighbor woman who'd finally found her own courage that morning too. Nascha lifted May onto her hip and stood there a long moment on the steps, letting the whole town watch her do it, letting them see plainly that nothing about this day had shrunk her down to the size Emmett Voss had hoped a forged deed and a marshal's badge might manage. She had buried a husband and a daughter under this same New Mexico sky and kept her ranch running through every winter, since a false charge and a crowded courtroom were never going to be the thing that finally broke her. If you're rooting for Nascha the way we were riding her, tap join beside our channel name and become a member. It keeps this channel telling stories like hers. They rode home together in near silence, May asleep between them on the wagon seat with one small hand fisted in Nascha's sleeve and the other in Rafe's, the way she'd taken to sleeping most nights since the fever, as though 4 years old was old enough to already understand the wisdom of holding on to both the people who'd carry you. The New Mexico sky went violet and then black, overhead thick with more stars than either adult had bothered to notice in months of simply surviving one day into the next. When they finally reached the ranch, Rafe carried May in and laid her under the red woven blanket, tucking it around her shoulders the exact way he'd watched Nascha do it 100 times now without either of them remarking on the fact that he'd learned her habits by heart, quietly, the way a person learns the habits of somewhere they mean to stay. He found Nascha in the kitchen afterward, sitting at the long table by a single candle, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold an hour before, staring at nothing in particular, the way people do when the day's danger has finally passed and left them alone with everything they were too busy to feel while it was happening. Rafe sat down across from her, the two of them worn thin and hollowed out and, for the first time in a very long while, entirely safe. I thought they'd take you from us. I don't know what I'd have found to tell her, how you explain a thing like that to a child who's already lost one mother. Nascha's eyes lifted to his, dark and steady in the candlelight, and something old and guarded in her finally visibly let go. I made that plain once already. I wanted a daughter to fill this house again. I didn't know I'd get a man worth riding 2 days without sleep for, thrown in besides. A small, real smile finally cracked through the exhaustion on her face, the first one Rafe had seen unguarded since the day they'd met at her gate. I'm still just a drifter, Nascha. He turned the coffee cup slowly between his rough hands, not quite able to meet her eyes for the next part. Nothing to my name, but the shirt on my back and a hammer I don't even own. I can't offer you land or money or anything. A woman like you ought to be given. She reached across the table and stilled his hands with her own, waiting until he finally looked up before she went on. You rode into a land office and put your own name on paper against a man like Voss to save mine. You raised your voice to no one, drew no gun, and still you brought me home free. That's worth more than every deed filed in Silver City. She drew a slow breath, the kind that costs a guarded person something to spend. I want more than just a daughter now, Rafe. I want you to stay because you choose to, not because a dying child once needed a bed. I want a husband. I want this to be your home, because it's your home, not because you had nowhere left to walk. Rafe stood, came around the table, and pulled her gently to her feet, the way he'd wanted to for weeks, and never once let himself believe he'd earned the right to. He didn't hesitate. Then I'm staying, for exactly that reason, and no other. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed and it wasn't shy. It was the kind 2 people arrive at only after they've already survived the worst the world could throw between them. built on 2 seasons of fence mending and fever breaking, and at long last on trust that had been earned one hard day at a time rather than handed over cheap. Winter came down hard that year, the way it always did in that country, but the ranch house stood warm against it, with wood stacked to the rafters and a cellar full of what Nascha and Rafe together had put by with their own hands. May grew strong through the cold months, chasing chickens across the frozen yard in a coat Nascha had sewn from an old blanket, calling both the adults in that house by names that belonged to family, now, rather than to strangers who had once shared a roof out of pure desperation. She learned to braid her own hair the way Nascha had taught her, and on the evenings when the wind howled loudest, Rafe would carve by the fire, while Nascha shared with May the old stories her own mother had once passed down to her, weaving Chody's memory and little Naline's into the telling gently. So the child growing up in that house would know she had come from love twice over. Not once. Emmett Voss sold his herd the following spring and left the territory altogether, his name good for nothing anymore in any land office between Silver City and the Arizona line, and Cottonwood Springs, having gotten its scandal and its lesson, both in the same season, mostly kept its opinions to itself from then on. Amos Dobbs stayed on in the county, sober for the first time in years, and would tell anyone curious enough to listen that the bravest thing he'd ever done was ride 2 days, on no sleep beside a stranger, to undo one lie he was ashamed of ever speaking. They were married in the spring when the desert bloomed briefly and fiercely the way it always did after a hard winter, by a traveling preacher who happened through Cottonwood Springs on his circuit, and agreed to stay the extra day once he heard the story from half the town at once. May walked ahead of them down an aisle of trampled wildflowers in a small blue dress. Nascha had stitched by candlelight over 3 long nights, scattering petals she'd gathered herself that morning with a seriousness that made the whole gathered crowd laugh through their tears. The blacksmith's wife, who'd nodded to her once across a silent store, stood near the front that day, with tears openly on her own cheeks, and the old rancher who'd tipped his hat to Rafe brought a wedding gift of good rope and a young bull calf, gruffly insisting it was nothing worth thanking a man for. No one in that yard thought of Rafe as a drifter anymore. No one traded quiet gossip about the widow and the stranger. They simply watched a family stand together in the New Mexico sunlight, forged out of a fever and a bargain and a courtroom none of them had ever wanted, and understood at last that they were watching something worth every hard mile it had taken to get there. By the time May turned 6, the ranch had 2 more hands on the payroll, a new well that never ran dry even in the driest August, and a reputation across 3 counties as the outfit that had faced down Emmett Voss and come out the stronger for it. Nascha still ran the books herself, still rode the fence line every morning before the heat came up, and still braided May's hair every night, the exact same way her own mother had once braided hers, weaving in, when the girl was old enough to ask, the story of the winter that had taken Chody and Naline. And the fever-hot afternoon, a stranger and his dying daughter had walked up out of the heat shimmer and given her back a reason to keep the fire lit. Years afterward, when travelers passed through Cottonwood Springs and wondered aloud about the ranch with the good water and the wildflowers planted thick along its fence line, the old-timers recounted it differently, depending on who wanted to hear it. Some named it the story of the widow who wouldn't be moved off her own land. Others named it the story of the drifter who rode 2 days without sleep to save the woman who'd saved his child first. Nascha herself never much cared which version made the rounds, so long as the ending stayed the same. She had wanted nothing more that first afternoon at her gate than a daughter to love in a house gone too quiet after the winter that took everything she had. She got that, and then, against every hard lesson the frontier had ever taught her to expect, she got so very much more besides. A husband who chose her freely, a daughter who reached for the word mother on her own, needing no one to teach her, and a home that no forged deed and no jealous neighbor would ever again have the power to take from her. Family, she liked to say in her last years, was never about the blood a person was born with. It was about who rode back for you when the whole world had already ridden away, and who stayed once the danger had finally passed.